The most famous prison transformation in cinema history never actually happened. Spoilers ahead. We are told a story about a banker who enters prison as one person and emerges 19 years later as someone fundamentally different. Someone transformed by hope and persistence and the brutality of confinement. But if you track the actual decisions his character makes across 2 decades, what you find is not transformation at all, but rather the slow revelation of who he always was. A person whose core psychology never bends even slightly under the weight of institutional control. And this distinction matters because the story works so hard to convince us we are watching a man learn to survive when what we are actually seeing is a man who already knew exactly what survival required long before the prison doors closed behind him. Andy Dufresne walks into Shawshank with a specific psychological engine already running, and every choice he makes for the next 19 years is consistent with that engine, which means the question isn't how prison changed him, but rather how someone with his particular psychological makeup would inevitably navigate a system designed to break people who think the way he thinks. And the answer to that question is what the story actually shows us when you strip away the emotional framing that wants us to believe in redemption arcs and personal growth. Before we see Andy in prison, we see him in a car with a loaded gun, drunk and considering murder, sitting outside a house where his wife is with another man. And this moment is designed to establish doubt about his innocence. But what it actually establishes is something more useful for understanding everything that follows. This is a man who, when faced with the complete collapse of his personal life and marriage, doesn't rage or weep or beg or demand explanation from his wife directly, but instead sits alone in a car running calculations about consequences and outcomes, playing out scenarios in his mind about what would happen if he walked into that house with a gun, what the legal ramifications would be, what the social costs would be, what the probability of success would be for various definitions of success, and then ultimately deciding not to pull the trigger not because he doesn't have the capacity for violence, but because the cost-benefit analysis doesn't work in his favor. This is critical because it shows us that Andy's default response to catastrophic emotional situations is not emotional at all, but rather ruthlessly logical, a trait that most people would consider emotionally unhealthy or even pathological, but which becomes the exact psychological feature that allows him to do what he does in prison. And the story never once suggests this calculation-driven approach to reality is something he develops in Shawshank. He arrives with it already fully formed. When Andy first speaks to Red about getting a rock hammer, the interaction reveals something the story treats as a character quirk, but which is actually the foundation of everything that follows. He doesn't ask for tools or contraband the way other prisoners do, with desperation or bravado or the social performance of toughness, but instead approaches a transaction as if he's negotiating a business deal in his former life as a banker, polite but direct, specific about requirements, clear about timeline, and most importantly, completely unbothered by the fact that he is now living in a world where the social rules have fundamentally changed. Most people entering prison experience a psychological crisis as they realize the identity they build in the outside world means nothing within these walls, that their education and professional status and middle-class manners are not just irrelevant but actively dangerous in an environment that operates on entirely different status hierarchies. But Andy never experiences this crisis because he never actually invested his core identity in those external markers in the first place. The banker identity was always just a role he performed because it was useful in that context, the same way he now performs a role of compliant prisoner because it's useful in this context, and the ease with which he switches between these performances without any apparent internal conflict tells us that his actual psychology exists somewhere beneath both of them, in a place that institutional walls cannot reach. The famous scene where Andy plays Mozart over the prison loudspeakers is usually read as a moment of rebellion or artistic transcendence, a man reasserting his humanity in the face of dehumanizing control. But if you examine what actually happens in this scene, and more importantly what happens immediately after, you see something different. Andy locks himself in the warden's office, plays the music knowing exactly what the consequences will be, accepts 2 weeks in solitary confinement without protest or surprise, and then emerges from that punishment to tell Red that the music was worth it because they can't get inside your head, which seems like a statement about the power of art and internal freedom, but it's actually a statement about psychological compartmentalization. Andy isn't celebrating the fact that he found a moment of beauty in a brutal place. He's confirming that his internal world has always been separate from his external circumstances, that the prison cannot touch the part of him that matters because he built that separation long before he arrived here, probably back in that car with the gun when he realized that his emotional life and his decision-making process needed to operate independently if he was going to survive situations where feelings would otherwise destroy him. The Mozart scene doesn't show us Andy discovering internal freedom. It shows us Andy demonstrating that he never lost it because he never located his core self in the external world to begin with. What makes Andy's relationship with the prison system so interesting is not that he learns to navigate it, but that he immediately understands it with the same analytical clarity he brought to banking, seeing it not as a moral outrage or a personal tragedy, but simply as a set of rules and incentives that can be mapped and exploited. When he offers to help a guard with tax problems, he's not trying to make friends or earn special treatment through kindness. He's conducting a test to see if the skills that generated value in his previous life can be converted into currency within this new economic system. And when that test succeeds, he immediately scales the operation. Not gradually or cautiously, but with the same systematic approach he presumably used to build his banking career, understanding that institutions run on self interest, and that people in power are always looking for someone who can solve the problems that make their positions vulnerable. The warden uses Andy to launder money not because Andy manipulates him into it, but because Andy correctly identifies what the warden needs and positions himself as the only person who can provide it safely, which is not the behavior of someone learning to survive in prison, but rather someone applying a pre-existing model of how power structures work to a new environment. The critical thing about Andy's escape plan is that it doesn't represent a turning point or breaking point, or even a decision point in any traditional narrative sense. Because if you track backward from a night he crawls through the sewage pipe, you realize he must have started digging within the first year or two of his sentence, long before he had access to the warden's financial records, long before he created the fake identity that would allow him to disappear, which means he was planning his exit almost immediately upon arrival. This completely inverts the emotional arc the story wants us to feel, because we are meant to believe that years of abuse and injustice slowly build until Andy finally reaches a point where he can't take anymore and decides to escape. But the actual timeline suggests he never accepted his imprisonment as reality in the first place. That from his very first days in Shawshank, he was operating under the assumption that the situation was temporary and solvable, and that every action he took for 19 years was part of a single continuous plan rather than a series of adaptations to changing circumstances. Most people would need years to psychologically accept that escape was possible or necessary, but Andy starts digging almost immediately because his psychology doesn't work like most people's. He doesn't need to emotionally process a situation before acting on it. He simply sees a problem and begins implementing the solution with the same methodical patience he brought to every other project in his life. What the story frames as Andy's triumph over the prison system is actually just a completion of a process that was always going to reach this conclusion given who he is. And this is why the escape works not through luck or dramatic intervention, but through the simple accumulation of small, consistent actions over time. Because that's how Andy's mind operates regardless of context. He doesn't experience a dramatic moment of defiance where he suddenly decides to dig through the wall. He experiences the wall as a technical problem with a time-based solution, and then he executes a solution with the same emotional flatness he brings to everything else, treating the most important decision of his life with the same analytical distance he brought to helping guards file tax returns or managing the warden's illegal finances. The genius of his plan is not creativity or boldness, but simply the recognition that institutional systems are designed to process people who react emotionally to their circumstances, and that someone who can separate their emotional experience from their strategic thinking becomes effectively invisible to those systems, capable of moving through them for years without triggering any of the psychological alarms that would detect normal human responses to captivity. When Andy crawls through 500 yards of sewage to reach freedom, the story wants us to experience this as a metaphor for the degradation he endured and the price of liberation. But what it actually demonstrates is his complete willingness to accept any physical cost as long as the logical equation balances in his favor. And this willingness is not something prison taught him, but rather something he arrived with fully formed. Remember that on his first night in Shawshank, he doesn't cry or panic when another new prisoner breaks down and gets beaten to death. Not because he's tough or brave, but because he's already running the calculation about what emotional displays cost in this environment and what they buy, and concluding that the exchange rate doesn't work. Most people would read this as shock or dissociation, but across 19 years we never see Andy dissociate from anything. We only see him continuously calculate, which means his apparent calmness under pressure is not a defense mechanism developed in response to trauma, but simply his baseline psychological state. The way is always process reality. The relationship between Andy and Red is usually interpreted as a friendship that teaches both men about hope and human connection. But if you examine what Andy actually gets from this relationship versus what he gives, you see something more instrumental. Red provides information about how the prison works, access to contraband that Andy needs for his plan, and social credibility with other inmates that makes Andy's presence less suspicious, while Andy provides Red with entertainment and conversation, and eventually the gift of hope about life after prison. But these exchanges are not equal in terms of what each person needs to survive. Andy uses Red the way he uses everyone in the prison, not maliciously but functionally, identifying what each person can provide and offering exactly enough in return to maintain the relationship without ever revealing what he's actually doing. And the proof of this is that Red spends 19 years as Andy's closest friend without ever suspecting the escape plan, which is only possible if Andy maintained constant operational security, even in his most intimate relationship. This doesn't mean Andy doesn't care about Red, but it does mean that caring and trusting are separate categories in his psychology, and he never lets the first compromise the second, which again is not a skill he developed in prison, but a feature of how his mind works. The moment after Andy escapes, when Red finds the rock hammer in the Bible and reads a note about hoping to see him in Mexico, we are meant to feel the emotional impact of a promise kept and a friendship honored. But what that moment actually reveals is that Andy spent 19 years maintaining a performance of connection while simultaneously planning an exit that he could not share with the person he was supposedly closest to, and feeling no apparent guilt about this necessary deception. A normal person would struggle with the emotional contradiction of genuinely caring for someone while systematically lying to them about the most important thing in your life. But Andy experiences no such contradiction because he doesn't process relationships as emotional bonds that require full disclosure. He processes them as strategic alliances that require appropriate information sharing based on operational necessity. And this is not a prison adaptation, but a core feature of his psychology. That probably explains why his marriage failed in the first place. His wife likely experienced him the way Red experiences him, as someone who seems present and engaged but who is actually operating behind a wall of calculation that never fully opens even in moments of supposed intimacy. What makes Andy's story feel like a triumph is not that he changed or grew or learned something new about himself, but that he found an environment where his particular psychological abnormalities became advantages rather than liabilities, where the exact traits that made him unsuccessful at marriage and vulnerable to wrongful conviction became the tools he needed to execute an impossible escape. In normal life, his inability to process emotions in real time, his compulsive need to maintain control through information asymmetry, his tendency to treat every interaction as a strategic problem rather than a human connection, these traits will be diagnosed as pathological, but in prison they are survival mechanisms. And more than that, they are the specific mechanisms that allow him to do what no one else in Shawshank's history has ever done. The story doesn't show us a man transformed by his circumstances. It shows us a man whose circumstances finally match his psychology, creating a temporary alignment between who he is and what the situation requires. And then we celebrate this alignment as if it represents personal growth when what it actually represents is the random convergence of a specific environment with a specific pathology. The person who walks out of that prison after 19 years is fundamentally the same person who walked in, still running calculations instead of feeling feelings, still maintaining perfect operational security even with people who trust him, still treating every relationship as a means to an end rather than an end in itself, still completely convinced that his way of processing reality is not a limitation, but simply a more effective model than what normal people use. And the story never challenges this conviction because it works within the prison context. But the question the story doesn't ask is what happens when that same psychological engine meets situations where calculation isn't enough. Andy's plan works perfectly because prison is ultimately a logical system that can be gained by someone willing to invest enough time and maintain enough discipline. But most of life operates on emotional and social dynamics that don't respond to pure logic, which is probably why Andy failed at marriage despite being brilliant at banking, and why he'll likely struggle with whatever relationships he tries to build in Mexico. Not because prison damaged him, but because the traits that made him successful in prison are the same traits that make him unsuccessful at the kind of vulnerability that actual human connection requires. If you change the environment but the character stays the same, you don't get transformation. You just get different outcomes from the same psychological engine. And the story tricks us into reading those different outcomes as evidence of growth when what they actually demonstrate is that some people are better suited for survival than they are for living. That the skills required to escape impossible situations are often incompatible with the skills required to build meaningful lives once you're free. And that we celebrate Andy's escape without asking whether someone who spent 19 years maintaining that level of emotional control and strategic deception is even capable of experiencing freedom the way normal people do, or whether he'll simply find himself calculating the angles in every interaction until the day he dies, always planning, always performing, always alone inside a psychological fortress that even 500 yards of sewage couldn't touch.